We are going live, and I'm going to mute.
All right. Hey, everybody. I hope this is all working and going, and I'm sure that I'll hear from it. John, if you're out there who's managing this from a secret location, thank you for all of this stuff of getting us together. And I am not seeing the chat right now. So if I can figure out how to do that, that would be good. I'm going to hit this button there. And there's something that pops up in the screen. So if I can just move this over so I can see it. There we go. All right, I'm hearing a little video.
Yeah, that's me. Sorry.
Cut that off. What are you doing?
Sorry.
Yeah, we're doing it. So, all right, here we are. All right, this looks better. I hope this is going live. Hi, everybody. It's Tony and Janine next to me over to this side here with the third. I'm going to take my glasses off because all last week you could just see this, which was so sub Wayne's World that it was even bad for this operation. So this is episode or webisode, I don't know what you call these things, the third one we've done with what we're calling Brush Up Your Shakespeare. Week 1, 2 Fridays ago, we talked about Hamlet. We talked about the greatest kind of, monologue, soliloquy, where it was one actor talking to the audience. And then last week, we looked at probably the most famous scene that Shakespeare ever wrote in Romeo and Juliet with the balcony scene. And we talked about the language in that. And today, we're upping the ante here with our crazed, massive resources and production values and zooming in with Janine Kane here, who is a resident artist at the GAM, of course. And most of you, I'm sure, if you're tuning into this, you've seen Janine on stage a zillion times and over a long time. Janine and I have been working together at this theater since 1997 or something like that, I think.
Yeah,
with the Cherry Orchard.
Right.
And so many shows in between, including this one, Macbeth, which we're going to talk about today. So another, obviously, one of Shakespeare's kind of, he has so many greatest hits, but this is certainly way up at the top. And since we have some experience with this production, Janine even has a lot more than I do. Janine was most recently in another production of Macbeth. Where was that?
At Trinity Rep Company, and I played a witch.
Yeah, all over this thing. So Janine is, it's fair to say, an expert in this particular. She's not
no pressure.
We'll get your questions coming in on that. We're going to talk about the relationship of the Macbeths, Lord and Lady. And again, we're going to focus, as we have done in the last two, and we will continue to do as we do these, on the language. Just to remind everybody, if you're tuning in for the first time, a little bit of the raison d'etre of this entire operation was just to obviously keep connected with those of you out there who are our patrons and fans and work with us at the theater. In our time of quarantine and isolation, to kind of keep some art in our lives. And I also thought that it would be good to talk about this author that the GAM has dedicated a lot of stage time and its identity and brand to over the years, and particularly to address a couple of things which I think hopefully can enhance the experience of coming to see Shakespeare, enjoying Shakespeare from an audience's point of view, and making it clear and acting it more powerfully and resonantly from an actor's point of view. As I think I mentioned in our first episode, I had a patron of ours in the lobby this year say to us how much she loved the theater and that she's been coming for so long. And then she said, and she kind of whispered, I give my tickets away when you do Shakespeare. And so I was like, no, please. And I said, look, we're going to be doing it next year. We hadn't announced yet about Richard II. And I said, so promise me that you'll give us a shot and you won't give your tickets away and you'll come. And if you don't like it, then you can come and hold me to account. So I'm kind of doing this for her. We're doing this for her. And to say that, again, Shakespeare is not as difficult as you might think it is. And if I could put it, let's see if we can share the kind of blame here. I would say 70% of that is our problem. That means Janine and I and everybody who gets on stage and does it. 70% of the reason why you might not like it or you might have a little problem with it is because, or you don't get it all, is because we're not doing a good enough job. So we're going to talk about those things we do in rehearsal to throughout this with the language to make it clear. Yeah. And then I would say 30% is your fault if you're an audience member, if you come in with that anxiety that says, I'm not going to get it and it's not for me and all of those things. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I'm hoping we can bridge that gap a little bit, that we do a better job on our end of making it clear and bringing it to you. And then you kind of lose that fear and lean forward and engage and meet us halfway. And then we've got something incredible. So let's get to it. We're talking about Macbeth today. So we're going to kind of chart through. I'll have to take my glasses on and off as I look at some of the text here.
I forgot my glasses. I hope I can read.
Can you see? Yeah.
Yeah, I can see.
Yeah, contacts are always good. in
I
this
know.
thing, and I don't have any, and I don't know if I would be able to even use them. But so we're going to start a little bit towards the beginning of this play. I'm going to assume that many of you know a little bit about the story, but just to give a little context here, as probably most of you know, Macbeth gets a prophecy in the beginning of this play that he's going to get all sorts of kind of honors bestowed upon him. The biggest of which is become the new king of Scotland. But in order to do that, there is a current king of Scotland. He's going to have to get that king out of his way. And it doesn't look like he's an older guy maybe, but he's not on his deathbed or anything else. And he has named his son as his heir. So he's not even in line of succession. But because some of this prophecy has already come true, he's got it in his mind. Speaking of self-fulfilling prophecies is something this play is very much about. And he writes a letter home to his wife as he's coming home, and he says, this has happened to me. And so we're going to pick it up here from just after Lady Macbeth has read this letter, which says, basically, I'm coming home. This has happened. They told me this was going to happen. They said I could be king. What do you think about that? And the king is coming with me
Right.
to our house.
And this comes kind of like, you know, we've seen a lot of action so far. You know, we've had 2 scenes with Macbeth with the witches. You know, there's been so much that's happening. So I think Lady Macbeth comes in well into the play. You know, it's near the end of Act 1 that she comes in. So it's kind of hitting the ground running.
Yeah, we don't. So that's a great point, because we don't know anything about Lady Macbeth right now, really, other than she's married to this guy who we're following and who seems to be having a bit of a crisis of conscience. But he's on his way home. So she's just read the letter that says, I'm coming. And then she has a short speech by herself that we're going to look at the beginning of. So Janine, I'm going to ask you to take it from, this is Act 1, Scene 5, and from Glamis thou art. When you know, Glamis and Cawdor, for those of you who don't know, just to kind of set this up, is his titles. He is the Thane of Glamis, he is the Thane of Cawdor, and one of them is a new title that he didn't have before he left for this war. So she is excited by the prospect of what's coming next.
Right, so Glamis thou art, and Cawdor, and shall be what thou art promised. Yet do I fear thy nature. It is too full of the milk of human kindness. And that's great, right?
Yeah.
Milk
So
of
let's
human
let's
kindness.
take that for the minute, right? So right off the bat, we hear one of these things that we think is crocheted on the pillow that Shakespeare invented, the milk of human kindness. But this is the first time a human being saying this phrase, right? So she's coming up with that. She's not saying an old saw. Yeah, it's something that she's kind of created. And this is such great language here. We get the titles first, right? So they mean something. So Janine, as you go through this, I think thinking of the Glamis and then Cawdor, right? It's the new one. It's like, okay, this is a bigger thing. And shalt be, line break, what thou art. And how does that scan? What thou art promised said, yet do I fear thy nature. Is that too long, or how does that go? What thou art promised, yet do I fear thy nature. It seems what thou art promised said, yet do I fear thy nature. Is that how it wants to go? That's an over full line there.
It's got an extra foot to it there. It's got an extra. So
so I don't. We can try that, but this is a little bit of inside baseball stuff. But just as we go through this, but I think promised wants to be, you know, it goes Glamis, Cawdor, then boom, what thou art, and that has to be implied in that word promise, the kingship. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's that how big that is. And yet then the change, then we get this kind of opposite thing. We've been really harping on this over these last 2 episodes of how an actor needs to really balance the kind of opposites here. Yeah.
And this comes up with all the opposites throughout this whole speech, as you want this, but you're this. Yeah.
So it said, you have promised, yet do I fear thy nature, right? And so we learned something about both of them in this speech, where she starts and something about this guy. And it's really important over the course of this play, because oftentimes we see this as Lady Macbeth is, you know, ooh, she's the literally, as he says later, the spur that pricks the sides of my intent. She makes him do it. She manipulates him into doing it. It's a little much more complicated than that. And that where we see them as moral figures kind of cross each other in the center of the play, where one comes to contend with the moral kind of consequences of her behavior, and where the other one makes it worse or wades deeper into that pool of blood as this goes on. It's worth saying that the Macbeth is probably the darkest of Shakespeare's plays, and that's saying something. It happens almost literally all in the dark, and it's the shortest of his tragedies. It's one of the shortest plays he ever wrote. It really goes like a buzzsaw right through from the beginning to the end. And no sooner does this happen happen. Then, you know, she reads this letter, he comes home, they set up the plan, Duncan is dead. It happens.
That's it. Yeah.
So let's go back on that. Glamis Cawdor promised, yet do I fear thy nature. And then you can take that line break to say, you're too good. You know what I mean? And let's see how that plays. Yeah.
Glamis thou art, and Cawdor, and shall be what thou art promised. Yet do I fear thy nature.
Good. Yeah.
It is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way.
Yeah. So connect that.
Connect that. Yeah. It is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way.
You can still, it's interesting with this thing with line breaks in Shakespeare too. For those of you who are looking at it on the page, you see where the line breaks in the verse line, right? So to right there, the verse line is too full of the milk of human kindness. Line break, to catch the nearest way. Now, it's not that we want to pause in there, but it does give us a chance for a breath or a micro beat to come up with the phrase, to come with the next thing, to catch the nearest way. What does she look? You're too good to do what you really need to do. You know what I mean? So this gives us a sense of her thinking through this. Can you try that again? Yet do I fear thy nature?
Yet do I fear thy nature. It is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way. Yeah,
the nearest is really important there, isn't it? Right? The nearest way, which means the quickest path. So if you can do that in your voice there, right? That's great. To the nearest way, like we can really.
We want to do it quick.
Yeah, you have to, right? Yeah, absolutely. We'll talk about the end of this when she gets to the rest of the speech later after the messenger comes in. That this has to be, as Amelia says in Othello, right? Done just as well in the dark, right?
Right.
These things have to be under cover of night, and we can't even think of them. If we think of them too much, all hell goes loose, which is really what this play is about. As he kind of interrogates the consequences, we see them both fall apart, right?
Right. Right.
So let's just jump a little bit. Thou wouldst be great from there, and then this is the last part of the speech we'll take here.
Thou wouldst be great, art not without ambition, but without the illness should attend it.
That's great. And playing that up in your voice, right? Yeah. Thou wouldst be great. He wants to be this. Great. Right. And you have it. You are ambitious, but you don't have the thing that makes ambition take everything, right? You don't have the illness. And I love that Shakespeare calls it an illness, right?
Right.
He's a very political writer, and he understands how tyranny works very, very well, right? And there's something about, we're all ambitious. We all kind of want to strive, and ambition is not necessarily a bad thing, except when it's so, when it becomes megalomania, right? When it becomes ambition is over. And that's an illness. That's like almost becoming a psychopath. We can think of many figures in our lives, political lives, certainly, whose ambition is somehow spoiled, is somehow rotted, right?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
That's great. Yeah. Thou wouldst be great are not without ambition. And then repeat it without. Yeah, and again, hearing you say that in your voice. So can you take that one more time and just even more so balance those two ideas against each other?
Yeah. Thou wouldst be great, art not without ambition, but without the illness should attend it.
Yeah, illness. Isn't that great? We hear that. And
illness.
And in a sense in there too, when you play it, this is, as we kind of go through and try to measure this language, I always hear in that she's actually, the action there, right, is that she's actually trying, she's not even talking to him, and yet she's trying to influence him even there. It's like, you need that. You need a little bit of that illness in order to make this work.
Right.
So let's jump ahead a little bit. The messenger comes in and says, guess what? You just got that letter, but they've overtaken it and they're here, or they're just about to walk in the door, and the king is here and Macbeth is here. Uh-oh, this is going to go into overdrive. She doesn't even have time to breathe. Yeah. And so the messenger leaves and says, towards the bottom of this, she sends him out saying, give him tending, he brings great news. So she knows her husband's about to come in, and then she's got time alone. And here we go to a very famous soliloquy, meaning it's just her and the audience and perhaps a candle in the dark, right?
Yeah.
And she gives us some of this. So this is you'll recognize some of the speech. Go ahead.
The raven himself is hoarse that croaks the fatal entrance of Duncan under my battlements. Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here.
Great, isn't that great? And I love what you did with that, Janine, too, that it's two syllables, right? That unsex, and they're both strong stresses rather than unsex me here. We really hear that this is an interesting
That's-
thing too for actors out there. Like when you stress a word that's in an unstressed position. So if we just look at that line and it says that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here. So the iambic rhythm goes to unsex me here. But because Janine in that smartly chose to say unsex me here, she put a really heavy stress on that un, and because it's in a kind of counterpoint or a contrapuntal position there, it actually rings out even more. And then you see this demented wish, right? What does it mean to unsex yourself, right?
Right. And it doesn't mean to take away my sexuality, take away my feminine wiles. It means that she wants to get the mettle of a man, to reinforce her, to strengthen her in a way that in this time anyway, and only a man could do.
Right.
And find that even keel against and with him, with Macbeth.
And which
in order to-
ironically, he doesn't seem to possess at that point, right? That she
Right.
had to kind of spur him on as a man. And as a guy who, as you point out with the action of this first scene, he begins this play, the first thing we hear about him, I think before we even see him, is that he cut a guy in half, right? From the
Right.
nape of the chops,
Right.
cut a guy in half. So we know he is a warrior. He's capable of great bloody, aggressive violence against other
Yeah.
human beings. And yet that is in the context of honor, in the context of war, at least in that society, versus what is happening here, which is coming down to you're about to kind of contemplate and commit cold-blooded murder. Or one of the first times this word is used is in this play, assassination, right?
Right.
The assassins, I hope everybody out there watched our parody video. Everybody's got the right to be healthy with the cast of assassins, but assassin actually is one of the first times we hear it used is in this play, or at least assassination as that part of speech, you know, as he would kind of work with, take a word that we use this way and use it a different way, and as he does famously in the speech later. So.
Yeah.
So if we could take it back to the top of this and make sure, and that's just for an acting thing, that the raven himself is horse that croaks the fatal entrance. That's very heightened speech, right?
Right.
Perhaps we even hear a raven caw, right? So this is full of like omens in this play, animal omens, omens of the natural world. We hear owls screech. We hear stories of horses cannibalizing each other, eating each other.
Yep.
You know, nature is upended. And so we get that right at the top with something happens, this symbol of death, you know, quoth the raven, nevermore. It's, we hear Poe, right? A little before his time. And this sound happens, that means death is coming, right?
Right.
And she says, even that, there's my cue, right?
He knows, yeah.
So hear that raven that croaks the fatal, and really see register-wise, we've been talking a lot about shifts in register, that we get something that is invoking something larger than her, so that she's really praying in a black mass kind of way
Right.
to the gods of death and violence, or the devils of death and violence, right there, and then focuses the thesis of it by saying, and this is what I want from you, right? With that second thought, which is come you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts. And it's so simple, the unsex me here, so that we get this introduction to, you know, we've hardly met her and she pulls the candle out.
The first thing she does is invoke the dark arts, and has this kind of black mass
Right.
to steal her to this evil. Yeah. It's crazy. It's like the first page. It's the first thing she does.
Yeah. So I just want to point, before we move on, just to see, I'm looking in the chat thing, and I'm not sure if it's working or not, John, but I haven't seen anything come up on that. So I'm not sure if maybe I need to click on something here. Hold on a minute. See, this is oh, there it is. This is a bunch of people saying, hi, Janine.
Hi.
And for Janine. Janine, what has been your favorite Shakespeare role you've played so far?
Oh, there's been a lot. I still always go back to like the OG, I love playing Beatrice. She's my favorite person and character, and because Much Ado is it's a comedy, but there's so much heart and there's so much depth to the language and to that character in particular. For me, you know, there's other than just playing her on the surface, there's so much more going on with her, and struggling with trying to find out what she wants and who she is and what, you know,
And she says the same thing you just were talking about, right? She has that great speech. She says, if I were a man, right, I would what, eat his heart in the
Eat
market?
his heart in the marketplace.
Yeah, that's a
my
Beatrice
favorite line ever. Yeah.
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 From
It's
Much
just
Ado, from a comedy. I would
right.
eat his heart in the market.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah.
Yeah, and perhaps we'll come back to this, and we should talk about that play too. Janine and I had the chance to do that a couple of times actually, and what a wonderful, wonderful comedy. Hello, what are your thoughts on the Macbeth curse? Ask Armand. Hey Armand, how you doing, man?
Hey Armand.
Yeah. There's those of you who aren't work in the theater every day. Macbeth has a kind of curse around it, and you're not supposed to say it in a theater, or you have to go outside. There's all these rituals around it. It's really just, you know, stuff that every kind of job has its superstitions, and that's one in the theater. You know, it's because of productions that have had bad things happen, and Orson Welles did this so-called voodoo. It was, you know, it's a lot of superstition, and it's really just some fun, but you know, not holding truck with that kind of thing. It's best to have fun with it and not let it rule your life.
Especially when you're doing the play. There's not much you can do about it.
Oh, and then Isabel asked, this is good. This is getting to, with James the First, who was the king at the time this play was written, being so critical of witches and magic, do you think Shakespeare intended Macbeth to be in retribution to those beliefs, especially with the play being about the assassination of a king? I think there's a lot of written on the history of this play, which I would really recommend, Isabel, if you're looking for some stuff. There's a great book by Antonia Fraser called The Gunpowder Plot, which was happening around this time. So there's a lot of historical context for it. There's also a great play by what's his name? I'm forgetting his name from that. It's called Equivocation. Why am I don't know. It's dementia, but a great play called Equivocation about the writing of this play that maybe we'll do someday. But it's a really wonderful play that looks at the politics around this, and that argues it's a fun play that says that James was actually kind of demanding he write this one play that was going to support him around the time of the Gunpowder Plot, and he ends up writing Macbeth, which both does flatter the king's superstitions, etc., and at the same time makes its political points. But Shakespeare had to be very careful always about writing anything that would get him in trouble. The play we're going to do next year, Richard II, was famously used by the Earl of Essex. He paid for a performance by Shakespeare's troupe to put it on because he wanted to kind of depose Elizabeth, and they watched the play, and then people left the theater and headed to the thing to do it, and of course it didn't work, and Essex was I believe executed after that, and or at least punished badly, as some of the people were, and the actors were really like, oh we're in real trouble here. We can't, they're going to revoke our license. So he had to be very careful about how he wrote in and around anything that affected the king or the ruling class and the people who actually were, allowed him to do his job. So good. So let's get back to the text for a sec. So again, can you just take that from the top, the raven himself, his horse, and see if we get those two moments in there just to unsex me here. Yeah.
The raven himself is horse that croaks the fatal entrance of Duncan under my battlements. Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here, and fill me from the crown to the toe, top full of direst cruelty.
Yeah, great, right?
I love that crown. It's not the head to the toe, it's the crown to the toe.
Right, isn't that great? That's such a great point, that from the crown, it automatically, Shakespeare's so specific with his language that instead of just you pulling out the cliche of from head to toe, he says to crown, which is the thing they want to get. You know what I mean? It's that's a great point. And specifically, again, always coming back to that first principle, which we've talked about, which is why these words now, right? Crown is great. And then you keep, and the next thing is what? What's the next thing you say is so great?
Make thick my blood.
Make thick my blood.
Make thick my blood. And then all the talk about blood throughout the whole play. Obviously, it's a bloody play, but there's talk about the word blood comes up all the time.
Yeah, take us through it. Make thick my blood. And really focus on the bodily stuff here of what she's saying. It's the physiology of this is great.
Yeah, make thick my blood. Stop up the access and passage to remorse, that no compunctious visitings of nature shake my fell purpose, nor keep peace between the effect and it. Come to my woman's breasts and take my milk for gall, you murdering ministers, wherever in your sightless substances you wait on nature's mischief. Come, thick night, and pall thee in the dunnest smoke of hell, that my keen knife see not the wound it makes, nor heaven peep through the blanket of the dark to cry, hold, hold.
Wow. Yeah. And
It's
it seems
great.
like just an earlier point about, their crossing and the moral consequences of this, that we do get the hint right at the beginning that there's the stirrings of conscience already, right? In that
Yeah.
last thing saying, I don't want to have to see what I'm doing, right? And
Yeah.
later we know that she says, I would have killed him myself, but he looked like
Reminded me of father.
my father, right? Yeah. And just to trace, and Janine did this so brilliantly in the production, is to trace the elements of conscience and the elements of humanity that still exists within this raging kind of ambitious person, to always keep her grounded in the human versus it making it about, I don't know, sometimes with this play, I think Iago, sometimes Lady Macbeth, there are certain characters that where, because what it seems so extreme that actors tend to let it exist in kind of like, psychopath land where we don't connect with the human striving underneath. And I think that doesn't mean that what they do is not psychopathic and not evil, but at the same time, when we can kind of trace the human psychology, we stay connected to them and see it as something within our experience versus, oh my God, right? We do want to understand somehow, and Shakespeare doesn't short on the psychology of these characters to make them complex and three-dimensional human beings despite their actions. Yeah. That's great. And I love in this speech, as it's so wonderful, as we talked about all this bodily stuff, it's make thick my blood, which is going to stop up the passage, anything that's going to make me remorseful.
Anything that's going to make me, yeah.
And then the shake my fell purpose, that word fell is so great. Yeah, it's like the way that those two syllables come in, and then literally come to my woman's breasts and take my milk for gall, right? That later, of course, in the scene when they finally kind of get to have an extended conversation, we hear about this image kind of comes back a little bit, right? And she talks about, what does she say in that?
I've given suck, I've nursed a baby, and here's what I do. Yeah.
Which is dash its
dashes, yep.
brains out or whatever, right?
Dashes brains out.
So with that image, it's very important to Shakespeare that she introduces this image about mothering and then destroys it basically in the next sentence. Even with that, what is the language that you use here? You say no compunctious visitings of nature, right? That nothing that's gonna say be kind, be compassionate, be generous, is gonna get in the way of that. So yeah, that's really, really, really great. Beautiful. And then of course we get at the end to cry, hold, hold, don't let me stop this, because if I think of it too much, I wouldn't stop it. We know we'll trace this depending on how far we get with this, but we know towards the end of the play, right? In the speech just before she kills herself, right? Spoiler alert for those of you who don't know this play. Her conscience drives her mad.
Yeah.
And famously out damn spot where she's seeing blood on her hands that's not there at the time, and she's that this conscience kind of comes roaring back over the course of a play as she witnesses her husband going the other way, right? And that it happens so fast and it unravels just as fast too, that these things have to happen in a certain way or for us to do them. And again, I think form and content we've talked a lot about with Shakespeare. There's a reason why this play is so short for Shakespeare. Is that it couldn't endure the length of Hamlet. You know what I mean? It needs to kind of happen like a short, sharp shock. And a lot of productions of Macbeth today, believe it or not, people do without intermission because they want to continue that thing that it just never ends. Wow. And so it cuts down, you play it almost in 2 hours, right straight through. Yeah.
It's relentless. Yeah.
It really is. Question from Juliet. Beautiful name, Juliet. Juliet Antonio, both Shakespeare names. What happened to, just ask, what happened to Lady Macbeth's child? I mean, that's not something Shakespeare deals with, really, right?
It isn't. And there's obviously, she says, I've given suck. There was obviously a child there, and there's nothing in the text that suggests whatever happened to that child. Did the child die? Obviously, the child lived long enough to be nursed. So did the child die as a baby? Did the child get to grow at some point and something happened? But there's definitely that element that I kind of grabbed onto as in playing the role, that there's some element of loss here, and there's some kind of grief that maybe doesn't drive shouldn't and wouldn't drive someone to the lengths that they go to, but there's something there. There's some element of a loss that's never going to be regained, because Macbeth does not have any heirs.
Yeah, and I remember talking about this in rehearsal, you know,
Yeah.
when we were working on it, and that you and Fred were really exploring that beautifully, I thought, and the idea that that what happens, you know, to people who experience that kind of tragedy and traumatic thing, and what is the consequence of that psychologically? Do they, you know, what does it make of them for the rest of their lives? Do they choose to then destroy, or to, you know, what is the, you know, what she seems to do, which is go towards something dark and negative, as if the world has no meaning left, so therefore
Right.
I will engage that, versus something more positive, like how do we deal with grief and tragedy? And I think, you know, we find these things in Shakespeare all the time. He's so great psychologically. You know, many of us, I'm not the first person to say this by any means, but he's really the first modern playwright, in that he's inventing a lot of the psychology, not inventing, he's unearthing and he's interrogating, he's talking about the kind of complex motivations of people that we think, you know, started with Chekhov, for instance, or Ibsen, right? And he's talking about them on stage really in a way that no other playwright had done up until, at least in English, until he started writing. And this is a great example of a psychology. It happens all through Hamlet's psychology, obviously is very complex. This reminds me a bit of, and we'll definitely have to talk about this down the line somewhere, Janine, is in Much Ado, right? That these characters, now that you mentioned that at the top of this, that Lady Macbeth and Beatrice, what they share versus seeming so such opposites. But because there's also that great moment towards the beginning of at the party in Much Ado, where Beatrice talks about her mom, right? And what is, do you remember what that is exactly?
Oh gosh, yeah, I don't remember the exact line, but it's oh,
you get the idea that maybe she
about
died in childbirth, or
yes, yeah, and that she's now a star, and that's and that's and that does give a sense of the melancholy that
right. Where does that other thing come from? Where are
Yeah.
these things, you know? And these are wonderful things, the clues that Shakespeare gives us about these characters that allow us to, you know, look at them in from a very modern way, because they're modern people. Remember, this is the modern period, but he was able to explain their psychology and kind of unearth it and pin it in things that would come later in the 20th century. Of course, Freud and other psychologists and people in that field would use Shakespeare as kind of case studies to look at kind of human behavior in a way, because he was so good at kind of seeing it and talking about it honestly and directly. Jennifer asked, does Macbeth lack ambition? No, I don't think he lacks ambition, but as Lady M points out in the beginning, he at least at the beginning, he lacks the illness that should attend it. He very quickly becomes ill, which we're going to see in this next scene, right? So in this next time we see them, we're going to jump ahead a little bit. Macbeth is alone. There's a party going on for the welcoming party for the king, right? He's not there. He's like off in another room. He goes back to the kitchen or something, and he's by himself because he's having a hard time dealing with what they're hoping to do. He has a long speech to the audience. It's a soliloquy to himself, right? Not to himself, but to talking to the audience of what is going on after they've kind of made this decision to go forward. He's having second thoughts, to put it mildly, right? Again, to address Jennifer's question, not because he lacks ambition, but because he yet hasn't caught the illness, right? Which he's about to get. Yeah. And he says in this speech, if it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. Isn't that great, right? That's the first line. And that's the first thing he says to the audience. Like, if we could just do it and it was done when it was done and it happened really fast and we could move on, everything would be fine, right? And wouldn't we all wish that were the way that life could be, you know? And he's basically asking for the impossible in this, which is always the illness of ambition, is you think you can get away with something that no human being has ever gotten away with in the history of human beings, right? It's like, oh, I'm going to be the first to figure that out. You know, I'm going to be the first person to murder someone and no one's going to know, you know, never really works out, right? Or especially assassinating a king. He says, if it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. And those three dones, again, the actor needs to be pointing those things up to say how, because Macbeth, being very smart, is using those very, very deliberately. And that quickly comes at the end. This is a very naturalistic piece of verse, despite the three balances of done. He's about to change that a little bit. And then he uses this word that I talked about for the first time. He says the word assassination. There's been assassin before, but he says if the assassination as a noun. The assassination, line break, could trammel up the consequence, which is explaining what he just said. If it were done when 'tis done, if it could trammel up. Now we don't know trammel necessarily. We don't use that word that often. You know, if we could trammel up, but you can hear in trammel what it wants to do, right? If it could just cover up, if it could get over the consequence, right? It could fold it all in so that there was none, right? It could just kind of forget about it. Trammel up, I can do with my voice, the consequence, consequence, and catch with his surcease, success, right? Isn't that a great balance, right? Surcease and success. And again, as an actor, in order for you to get that thought, I have to think about putting surcease against success. Surcease, we don't use that word anymore either, but we can hear in it, right? What's the last syllable of it? Cease, right? His, meaning Duncan, his surcease, right? His death, success. That were it. And then again, talk about famous lines. Here we go, right? That this blow could be the be all and the end all. Here. Now we've heard that a bazillion times, right? And so we're sitting there watching and going, is Macbeth using that as a cliche, like the way we use it today? That's the be all and the end all? No, he's making it up for the first time, like Milk of Human Kindness, right? To be the be all and the end all here. But here, he says, he repeats, he does the same thing as Hamlet. This is going to come back at the end of the play. We hear here a lot, hereafter, yeah. But here, upon this bank and shoal of time in the shallows, we jump the life to come, meaning we wouldn't care about the afterlife, you know, which means punishment, eternal punishment. If you do something like he says, we would just do it. So he's looking for reasons. He's looking for a way to make his conscience balance with the act. This is a moral calculus that he's attempting because he doesn't have yet the illness, and that without going through the entire speech here, he fails at, right? Because by the end of the speech, he talks about Duncan. And they both do this in here, which kind of grounds them in the human, which is really important. Whenever they talk about Duncan as a person, right, something happens to them. For Lady M, it's like he was like my father when he slept, or I couldn't do it. And he really is a father figure to Macbeth in so many ways. And so Macbeth pictures him and what a wonderful man he is, and a compassionate man. And he goes and he actually compares him. He puts a mythic kind of, he shouldn't be talking out loud because he's making the case. He can't make the case, right? He's trying to say, what do I need to do this? And instead he goes to a compassionate place. And he says about Duncan, besides, this Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office, right? So this is a list again, like we talked with Hamlet, that has to build. He says his faculties so meek, he's so nice when he goes about doing everything, so clear in his office, such a good king, right? That his virtues will plead, and here he goes, now he's making a mythic, will plead like angels, just like Romeo did to Juliet, right? How he went from you're this, you're this, you're this, you're an angel, you're a saint, right? You're the sun, your moon, the stars, you're an angel, you're a saint. He's doing this. We turn in poetry as the register shifts. He's making Duncan into a mythic, and thus making him, in some sense, ironically, ready for death, right? Besides, and he says, would plead like angels, trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off, right? He's already explored this idea that he's going to be damned for doing this, and he can't get away from that, yeah? And he says there's no possible way, you know, this would, and he's going to talk about the crime against nature, against the history of the world, yeah? He says that this would be so bad that tears shall drown the wind in pity, right? That these angels, trumpet-tongued, would blow the horrid deed in every eye. That's how bad this would be. And we're going to hear these images come back, you know, that this is not just any everyday killing, nothing like the killing that he did in the beginning of the play when he was butchering people on the field of battle. This is a crime against order, against nature. Again, this is a deposition of a king, which is next to God, right? So there's something anti-divine about this. There's something actually evil about it, right? Something he explores in a lot of his plays. And he comes to the fact that he says, I can't do it, right? He says, I have no spur, line break, to prick the sides of my intent. Now we've heard that line, yeah? No spur to prick the sides of my intent, but vaulting ambition. Yeah. Again, back to ambition, which overleaps itself and falls on the other. He doesn't say it, but it means the other side. To vault onto a horse, I'm going to go leap. You know, you see this in all the cartoons, and they miss and they fall right on their ass. That's exactly what ambition does, right? We get so full of ourselves that we think we can take a longer leap than we can. Oh, I can make that 6-foot jump, and then we don't make it and we drown in the lake, right? I mean, that's ambition. You know, famous last words is, hey guys, watch this. Yeah, probably not the way you want to go out. And that's what he's saying. All I've got is ambition. That's not a good enough reason. I can't do it. So we think at the end of the speech that he's not going to do it. He's not done. He's just said, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent. And just like Romeo, he wills it into being, right? Romeo's like, oh, light, what light through yonder window breaks, and Juliet comes out. Just like that, right? He says, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent. It's the negative of Romeo, the end, you know, and she comes out, and here out comes Lady Macbeth. Right? And you want a spur? I'm the spur, right? Here's the spur, because if this play ends now, we don't have a play, right? So we need drama, we need conflict, we need the spur. Armand has a deep question here. Do the witches actually control Macbeth, or did they say the right thing at the right time to a power-hungry man? In other words, is it black magic or hubris that drives this couple through? That's the question. That, you know, that's the $64,000 question for any production, and I think it depends upon the context of the production. I think certainly in Shakespeare's day, the black magic of this, the witches, James's belief, he had written a treatise on witchcraft, which witches were very much believed in by not everybody, but a lot of people. They were drowned. You know, it was bad. This is 1605, I think. And so this is 87 years before Salem and everything that happened in our neck of the woods. So this is a bad time. I'm to be a woman in the, you know, it's like, oh Jesus, because, you know, anytime before what, 1970, it's crazy, this world, right? Yeah. So
Anytime.
So every production has to deal with that, right? And I think so some productions can, you know, I think more modern productions and contemporary, certainly I think the way that we kind of approached it was that they were these forces of, I remember Fred talking about a lot, like these forces of like the terrorist force, like the Joker and Batman. We talked a lot when Heath Ledger's performance, right? That someone who just wants to destroy, who has this kind of, you know, they're the negative in us. They're the kind of the thing that awful thing that drives us. That's
a little devil on the side, on the shoulder. Yeah.
And
whispering the things into your ear that knows what buttons to push and to get you to do. Yeah.
It's so great because he manifests our psychology, our modern psychology in an early modern or in a medieval way, you know, and both can play. And I think they play together beautifully. And so I think anybody coming to the show, even if the production presents the witches as having a supernatural force, and we might not believe in that today, it still plays psychologically real enough that we just thrill from the supernatural, but we understand. And I think Macbeth does it's very important, I think, in this production, that by the time all the prophecies come to pass, but they're so kind of lame by the end of it, you know what I mean? It's like the wood came to burn them, and it's just the guys using camouflage, you know. And then the worst of all is, you know, that no woman born. Like he's convinced that he can't die because everyone has been born of a woman, and no man of woman born could kill him. And all Macduff has to say is, my mother had a cesarean section, and that's the end of it. And certainly the way we played it was, when that happens, it's Macbeth has to acknowledge the absurdity of what he could possibly believe, that he was immune to the laws of physics like the rest of us, right? And so Macbeth has to play that when he says that, like, my jig is up, you know what I mean? Like, this is what was I thinking this whole time? Ambition and the illness that accompanies it has poisoned me against the actuality of being alive and being a human being in the world, right? That none of that matters, that I'm going to die like everybody else. And he frankly well deserves it by that point, right? Hey guys, watch this. So she comes in here, right? And she comes in and right off the bat, the language, this scene is great because the first time it really kind of starts to kind of go back and forth, and she has to argue him. What's she come in with?
And this is he has almost supped. Why have you left the chamber? It's just a husband and wife here. Now we're going to bicker.
Isn't that great? Great verse line, but he's just been like, he says, this highfalutin thing, right? He says, shall blow the horrid deed in every eye, that tears shall drown the wind. I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent. And then she comes in and goes, where the fuck were you?
Yeah.
Sorry. That's not, I don't know if the FCC guides this. Where were you? What are you doing? Right? Yeah. It's so direct and so great. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he replies, hath he asked for me? Boom.
No, you're not. He has.
And they
Yeah.
share this line. So if you're looking on the page, all of their back and forth here is about shared lines. Now, what that means
Right.
is when you're reading it, it means Shakespeare wants the actors to pick up the cues. So the verse line, there's no break in it. The verse line goes, hath he asked for me? No, you not.
No,
He
you're
has.
not. He has.
And so it has to pick right up. And
Yep.
then he comes back in with, we will proceed no further in this business. Yeah. And then he has to justify why they won't proceed no further. So that's a
Yeah.
great bit of kind of back and forth. What is it? Stick-em-a-tire or whatever they call it. You know, it's like a David Mamet piece of dialogue there, you know, bang, 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 bang. And that continues throughout. They've got some chunks of text in here as they convince each other of their arguments, but they always pick up the other cue and come right at it.
Yeah.
You know, I just want to look a little bit further down in this, Janine, and to that thing we were talking about earlier, the milk of human kindness, right?
Right.
Is the first time we hear milk, and then take my milk for gall, you murdering ministers, right? Is the second time, and then we get back to the image of it actually kind of coalesces here in their child.
Right.
And so around line 60-ish or so, you say, nor time nor place did then and here, and yet you would make them both. They had made themselves, and that their fitness now does unmake you. Yeah.
Yes.
And so, go ahead.
I have given suck, and know how tender 'tis to love the babe that milks me. I would, while it was smiling in my face, have plucked my nipple from his boneless gums and dashed the brains out, had I so sworn as you have done to this.
If we should fail, he comes
We
right back in. Right. And then he comes right back out. Right. And that actually is one full shared line is, have done to this. If we should fail, we fail. So they have to come back in. Yeah. Right away. Boom, 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 boom. He is shell shocked by that. He's assuming they're talking about a child that's theirs, both of them. Right. And he says, I would have taken our baby and dashed its head to the walls. And he goes, what? Whoa, what? And then she says, we fail, but we're not going to fail.
We're not going to fail.
Let's be brave, you know.
Screw your courage to the sticking place.
Yes, another one that we love, right? That we hear that sounds so modern. Screw your courage to the sticking place and will not
fail.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? And and then his response is, bring forth men, children only, right? And that is another thing we hear. And again, as Janina pointed out earlier, very rightly, a different time in the way we think about these things, but it was very much coded in that society. And she's already asked, unsex me here, you know?
Right.
And meaning maleness taking on the connotations of aggression, violence, and the illness that should attend ambition. Yeah. Right. And this is the creation of that illness over the course of this scene, so that by the end, he says, for thy undaunted metal should compose nothing but males. Yeah.
Right.
That they've just made this decision. Yeah. He's asked a couple of cleanup questions, but he's there already, right?
He's there already.
Yeah.
And it takes that thing. That's why I think the importance of there being a child that's missing. That's the thing. I mean, obviously, it's a gruesome visual anyway, and the language is so gruesome. Talking about plucking the nipple from its boneless gums, but it's still that shared loss. That still is the thing she goes to.
And I love that language that, you know, you're just pointing that out, that it's so anatomical, like in the previous speech where you looked at the beginning, so much about the physiognomy of the body. And that, why do you think he gets so, you know, Shakespeare's so specific there with that language, with boneless gums, and, you know, they're actually using anatomical language. What do you think about that?
I don't know. It just goes back to the visceralness of it, I guess, and the not only is it give you such an amazing visual, it's just it really goes back to the really base nature of what she's suggesting.
It's such a vulnerable thing to say, you know, to use a word like nipple and then to say boneless gums, to actually make the baby, and that connection of mother and child, which is so the pietà of it, right?
Yeah.
And then to say, and then to take that image and to say, I would dash its head, you know, and we know that we're picturing the baby. And if I'm picturing the physiognomy of that baby, I'm also picturing the delicate nature of a baby's head.
Right.
And the fact that the skull, I know I'm getting graphic, but these are the images that Shakespeare wants us to have to show the enormity of this, of what she's doing. Yeah.
It's so graphic.
Image. Yeah. And it should actually revolt us, you know?
Oh, I remember when I'd say it, there would be gasps.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it's just like the most vulnerable, the most helpless being that you could just, and being the mother figure. doing
no,
this to its own child.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then, right, you're talking about, and having to summon that up as an actor, Janine has, spoiler alert, 3 children whom she loves very, very much. But you come into this and say, like how do I, as a healthy mom, connect with this Medea-like impulse in order to get, it's a dark, dark place.
It's a dark place. This is
yeah.
a dark play, and it's a dark place to go every night. Yeah.
Well, luckily it's only 2 hours. It's short.
Right. It's short.
Christopher asks, what are your favorite film adaptations and favorite portrayals of do you have one of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth?
I'm trying to remember. I can't. There was one that I saw that you'll probably know. It's the one where it's not necessarily a favorite, but it's one that's the visuals stick to my mind. The witches kind of are never mind. I'm not going to be able to think of the version of it.
The Polanski one?
It might be, yes.
The witches start on the beach in the beginning, and they're like, it's very, very visceral. And it's a Polanski's film version of this, which came out right after the Tate LaBianca murders, and is a very graphic film. And John Finch plays Macbeth, and that is very, very good. Francesca Annis, very, very young Francesca Annis. I think she was still a teenager when she plays Lady M in that, and this is quite remarkable. I remember watching it in high school, and that was the first version of it I ever saw. I think the Kurosawa Throne of Blood, if you've ever, that Japanese incredible Japanese film adaptation of Macbeth, is an amazing piece of cinema, and the acting in that, from Mifune and Mifune and I forget the actress's name who plays Lady M, and that is frightening. And if you've never seen that, Janine, I would really recommend.
I'm gonna have to take.
It's really quite. It's very, very ghostly, and it's powerful piece of cinema. There's a recent version with a couple of great actors in it, Michael Fassbender and Marianne Cotillard. I love them both. It films a little too like they whisper everything, so it's the language never really kind of comes out of there. They're great actors, and some really beautiful visual stuff in it, but it doesn't quite ever come. I don't know. That's a hard thing with Shakespeare on film sometimes, is trying to make the language a little too
natural,
casual. It doesn't work, I don't think, as well. So now they're hooked into it, and they're going to do this thing, and they're off to the races. He has one more. He looks back. He lets her leave the room, and then he looks back to the audience for one little piece of conscience where he says, I am settled and bend up each corporal agent to this terrible feat. He's calling on the same thing she has called on. I need every single thing to help me do this. He's calling it terrible. He says to her, away and mock the time with fairish show, right? So mocking the time. Why look, everything's okay, even though our souls are corrupt and black and we're about to do this thing. Right. And then usually what happens is she goes back into the party. He's left with the audience where he begins, and he turns around and says, false face must hide what the false heart doth know. Yeah. And so we still see this conscience weighing on him very hard here. And Shakespeare loves to do this. And you might be asking when you see Shakespeare plays, he often ends scenes with rhymes. And it has the effect, hopefully, and an actor has to really know that and play that and make sure the rhyme isn't hidden in there, because the rhyme feels or plays like a button in a song in a musical, right? Dun dun, and it gets the audience to clap, which is an energy drive to the next scene. So we get, boom, what the false heart doth know, bang, we're on to the next scene. It gives us the energy to cry, and we really want to know once that happens. It's like it's the classical version of what Law and Order did so successfully for so many years, and I think it does. Dun dun, you know what I mean? It gets us. That's the end of the scene, and we know something else is coming. We've learned a little bit more. There's another kind of thing, a flower on the chain, and we're going forward. Yeah. Yes. So someone says, I love Throne of Blood. I agree. If you haven't seen Throne of Blood, check it out. There's actually a bunch of great, there's also Kurosawa's Ron, which is his adaptation of King Lear, which is a brilliant, brilliant film as well.
Great.
We should check out. So towards the end, we're getting close to the end of the play. And I wanted to get close to our time, not to the end of the play. We just started this play. But because we only got a few minutes left, she shifts into prose at the end once the conscience has kind of overwhelmed her, right? She's watched Macbeth kind of go to her route. I mean, he literally is cursed without sleeping in this, right? And he says, Macbeth shall sleep no more is one of the curses. And I actually believe that. I don't think he ever sleeps after he commits the murder. I think he's
Right.
so strung out by the end of this that he never really sleeps again. And his behavior certainly corresponds to that. We know that he has Banquo killed, right? He wants to kill Banquo's son, but Banquo's son gets away. He has Macduff's family slaughtered, which is maybe the most brutal scene Shakespeare ever wrote, where he sends in murderers to kill not Macduff, but his wife and his children. And the little ones. It's an impossible scene to watch. So if we had any sympathy for the guy who still has a conscience in this scene, it's really ebbing away fast. And surprisingly, maybe for some people, as she watches him go that way, he even kind of starts to kind of shut her out and says, you don't need to know. He says, dearest Chuck at one point.
Yeah.
And then she goes the other way. And the second half of the play, we rarely see her, and we see her come in for what's called "Out Damn Spot" is a very famous speech. And we know that when they had their hands covered in blood, the picture you saw at the top of the that led us into this, that John put up for us, they're both literally hands covered in blood. They washed them, and this image of trying to get the hands free of a blood that will never be unstained when you commit a murder has come down to us forever, and is something that she tries to. So what happens in this speech, the out damn spot?
Well, like you said about Macbeth not sleeping anymore, she's now sleepwalking. So she wanders, she's speaking her conscience. Now everything starts to spill out. So I always felt of it as different kind of parts of what's just happened to her coming to her, and she's at one point she's reprimanding Macbeth. You got to be a man, right? What need we fear who know it when none can call our power to account, right?
Yeah.
That's reminiscing back to, and the one too, well, now 'tis time to do it. It's the bells telling us that that's the time to do it. And then back, and fine, a soldier and a feared, who are you? You're a soldier. So the glimpses of what she did to spark this whole thing to go on, and then back to who thought that the old man would have had so much blood in him. And that's literal and figurative, because she had gone up to return the daggers and she had to see the carnage that was the death of the king. And then figuratively, that so much blood that it's still staining my brain and my hands and my conscience.
He does. Yeah, they say earlier, right? He said, "Will not all the water wash these hands clean?" And they say the images. He says something like, "Will make the all the water in the ocean in the world would make the." He says the blood on my hands would make the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red, which is an amazing thing that Shakespeare does there, because he completely invents the word incarnadine. Now, what does that mean? We've never used it again. It's only ever been used in this play. It means to make red, right? Incarnadine. And because he knows even his audience isn't going to understand that, he does just what great actors need to do, is he then says what it means. He says, making the green one red. Just in case you didn't know what incarnadine meant, that's what it means, that there's so much blood on my hands that the green water of the ocean would be completely dyed red, which is an image that comes back for her. So much blood in the old man, which we have to believe is a traumatizing event to her, which informs the playing of that previous scene. And this is so modern that she actually confesses to the entire thing. And the only person who knows is her husband, because nobody else knows she did it, even if they expect it. So the doctor is just like, wow, I think she just told us what happened. You know what I mean? It's so clear, right? As she's trying to wash away and scrape the stain of that, or pull or rip the stain of it off her hands. There's one thing in here that was so powerful when you did it in this scene. Shakespeare has a line, he says, has her say, "Here's the smell of blood still, all the perfumes of Arabia," it's another thing we hear a lot, "will not sweeten this little hand." And then the line is just, "Oh, oh, oh." Can you tell us about what that is?
Well, that's the scariest thing in the world for an actor to come across, even one O, but then three O's in a row, because it has to be something so heightened and so not casual. It has to be something that, like you said, I think in one of the episodes, howl.
Lear, right?
It can't be Lear saying, the word howl. It has to be a literal howl from his. So what did it, and it took a lot of Fred kind of pushing me to this, because I was resistant at first, because it has to be something so outside of what a comfort zone is, because there is no comfort zone here. It's that visceral kind of, that just all the guilt and pain and remorse just coming out in a vowel, you know.
Yeah.
And you know, it's funny you brought up that I have 3 kids, and it reminds me of, and I've told you this before, a time that I thought that 2 of my kids were missing. They were missing in my mind. They were missing, and a sound came out of my body that wasn't human. It wasn't anything that I have ever made before, or you know, have made since, thankfully.
Good, thankfully.
You know,
Yeah.
so thinking about that, and thinking about what is it that especially will make the doctor say her heart is sorely charged. It has to be something. So you know, without thinking of what the sound would be when it came out, it was one of those things that after, you know, I'm not much of a method actor or anything, but after just really kind of getting into an emotional place, just taking a deep breath, and whatever that sound is that comes out, and allowing it to be unfiltered and unthought of, and not trying to replicate that sound of when my kids were gone, but knowing that that happens. And if the grief and the guilt, because I thought that I had lost them, you know, came out in a sound, it doesn't have to be anything specific, or just an O, or just something that's it's that what is the sound of grief and pain and remorse. And
it was amazing, and I would get to hear it from backstage every night, and it went on for, you know, a long time past you think a human could continue to bellow. It was a keening and a sound that was, you know, it was brilliant acting. And it's a great, you know, lesson. We're going to end here. Shakespeare sometimes is the most overly ornate with his language, and gives us so much to kind of communicate all of these complex kind of psychological things that are going on in us, all of these complex emotions and the cost of them. And then sometimes he just levels us with something so simple and so direct, like the O. And for those of you who are, you know, fortunate enough to see Janine's performance in this, I'm sure you don't forget that moment. I still don't. It helped me act the rest of the play so much better than I ever would have, just by listening to it every night backstage, so that when I came out to have to deal with her death, that was still ringing in my ears, almost literally still ringing in my ears. And it's a moment on that in all of the time I've been in plays that I will never forget. So there's so much more to talk about with this play. We're just over 2 o'clock now. Thank you so much. I can't get to the rest of these questions. But we'll be back next week. I'm not sure what it's going to be yet. Maybe we'll continue this conversation. And Friday, it's going to be at 12 o'clock next week, though, because the governor's press conference is always at once. We want to move this so that people who are watching that can be a little lunchtime with Shakespeare. Thanks for tuning in. Janine, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was so much fun. Oh,
it's great. And John, thank you for managing this from afar. Hey, everybody, stay safe. Be kind to each other, and have a great week. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.